Terry Wolf, and I'm a member of the House Education Committee, and I have been asked to moderate our panel, which is going to be these fine citizens, who I'll just introduce in just a moment, and Dr. Tucker, and mostly I think it's just going to be an exchange back and forth for the most part, and I will occasionally nudge somebody maybe if they're talking a little too long. So I would like to introduce everybody. First, we have Dr. Virginia Berry. Just a brief snapshot of Dr. Berry's experience. Dr. Berry was sworn in as Commissioner of Education in 2009. She is responsible for promoting excellence in education and the provision of resources through the state and federal programs for all students. Dr. Berry has been recognized nationally for supporting a more holistic assessment of student achievement and support of students being college and work ready. She has over 30 years of experience in education as a teacher, leader, tenured university professor, and provost and vice president for academic affairs. Our next speaker is Scott McGilvery. He is president of the NEA New Hampshire, the state's largest public employee union with over 16,000 active members. Scott taught social studies for 24 years at Manchester Memorial High School and was the head football coach there as well. He's a very active child advocate, serving on the boards of New Hampshire Can, Kids Count, Reaching Higher New Hampshire, and America Votes. Scott has traveled to and studied both the public and private education systems of Ireland, the United Kingdom, and was part of the New England delegation of educators last year that visited the public schools and university in Finland. Joining us next is Tom Raffio. He is the president and CEO of Northeast Delta Dental, the Concord-based dental insurance company serving Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Under his leadership, Delta Dental was named one of the best companies to work for in New Hampshire and one of the 25 best small companies to work for in America. In addition to a very long list of organizations and awards from around the state, he is the chairman of the New Hampshire Board of Education, serving for his second term. And we have Mary Heath, who has over 42 years of experience in education. Mary has served as a teacher, administrator, researcher at RMC Research Corporation, as the Deputy Commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Education, and as the Dean of the School of Education at Southern New Hampshire University. She is currently a representative in the New Hampshire House and serves on the Education Committee. Thank you everyone for joining us, and what we're going to do is have everybody just kind of give a reflection or comments on the presentation we heard earlier. And Dr. Berry, could we start with you?
Thank you everybody for being here today. I wanted to thank Mark.
Here we go. Okay, great. So thank you everyone for being here today. We really appreciate it. I especially want to thank Mark for coming prepared to our state, because I think all too often we have speakers come to our state. We have, as you can imagine, in education, several people coming, and they're not really directed at the work that's specifically going on in the state. So I think it was really very helpful for you to recognize the work that is going on collectively in our state. And that we, since a huge part of your presentation is about higher education, I do want to be sure that everyone here today recognizes that our institutions of higher education, both public and private, have been deeply involved in this conversation and have taken it very seriously. They've actually formed, they're the only state in the country, they formed the higher education group, 501c3, so that they can, independent of their institutions, begin to talk about the critical element of the change process in teacher preparation and leader preparation programs. So that's a huge advancement. And I've asked Mark whether he would be willing to come this spring to talk with them and essentially give this same presentation, because you got really to the heart of the matter. But I was wondering, Mark, if you might just talk a little bit more about governance as you see it in terms of bringing about these types of changes.
I think I can do free-flowing. So when we visit top-performing countries, what we see is a single place where the buck stops, and that's called the Ministry of Education. The closest thing in the United States to it is not the United States Department of Education, which has almost no features and no responsibilities that are like those of national ministries elsewhere. The closest thing in the United States is the State Department of Education in our states. But we don't see the same institution when we look at the State Departments of Education as we do when we look at ministries, because in these other countries typically, and here I'll leave New Hampshire aside because you're an exception, we see the schools of education administered by the Higher Education Authority and the schools administered by a totally separate elementary and secondary education institution. But it's also the case in the United States that we see typically many other governmental and quasi-governmental bodies that have important responsibilities in education at the state level that do not report to the State Department of Education, or sometimes to anybody. And we also, in the United States, see many more functions delegated to school systems, school districts in the United States than is the case in other countries. And so that contributes a lot to the kind of disjunctions that I was describing in my remarks, where we say we want to do X, but in fact all the incentives are to do the opposite. Or you have incentives to do this coming from here, and incentives to do the opposite from over there. It's much harder for us in the United States to decide on an objective as a consensus of the people and then organize a concerted response to it. It's just very hard. Now we have other values, right? I mean, New Hampshire is home to those values, as are other states. You're not alone. But we have to understand what the trade-offs are, and I think we often don't. So that's a big governance issue. I think it ought to be possible for us in the United States to honor our very strong desire to keep things local, and at the same time to do a better job of coordinating the making of policy at the state level, and to sort out what's state and what's local than we do in the United States, which is often very confused.
Great, thank you. Mark, I found it very interesting having traveled abroad and spent most recently quite a bit of time in Finland. One of the things you brought up was the fact of having high standards, which we've had to fight a political battle over that in this country and still do. And the other part of that is that once you have the high standards, you develop competencies and competency-based education. Can you comment a little bit about competencies in high standards and how they're developed in some of these high-performing countries that you study?
I have absolutely no idea whose ox I am about to gore. But the word competencies makes me a little nervous because I think it's very easy to reduce the idea of competencies to the kinds of skills that you simply observe. You can tell whether a carpenter is doing a good job, but you can't often tell very much about the ethical standards that somebody's carrying around in their heads by looking at them. You can't tell very much about the extent to which they have a deep appreciation of the kind of art and architecture that the Greeks and the Romans developed. There are a whole lot of things, I think, in American education that all of us in this room really care about that can't really be described as competencies. And so I get a little worried about using that word because I think it can be reductionist. It can be reduced simply to the stuff that you can measure with a basic skills test or a simple occupational test. I think of competencies as the things you train for, but not necessarily what you educate for. And for me, there's a big difference. So having said that, right, to get to what I think your question was actually about, I think that in the United States for a very long time, what our schools have actually been about is sorting kids out along a bell curve. So that back in the 1940s, our psychologists in the United States persuaded American teachers that there was an enormous natural variation in ability. Some kids were dumb, some kids were very smart. There was a distribution on a bell curve in between. And it was unfair to ask kids who weren't very smart to do more than they were capable of. So, unlike most of these other countries, that's when we started sorting the kids out in elementary school classrooms. These kids are the robins, these kids are the bluebirds. Everybody knew which kids the robins were and which kids the bluebirds were, right? And there's a ton of research that shows that bright, very bright kids misassigned as a bluebird when bluebird meant the dumb kids. If they go through 3 or 4 years of elementary school and very little is asked of them, by the end of 4th grade, they've had it. These very bright kids have learned so little that they can't keep up with the other kids. In other words, expectations are everything. And so what we find in the top performing countries is they don't do that. They set high expectations for all the kids. To me, that's what a competency-based system ought to be about. That is the idea that you're going to set a performance level that you expect of all kids. The idea is not to sort all kids out. It's to make sure kids at least get to that very high benchmark. That would be a revolution in American education, but it is a revolution that many of these other countries. When we first went to Singapore, 1989, I discovered that they had a tracking system. I was very upset, very opposed to tracking because it sets different expectations for different kids. They had 4 different tracks. Then I discovered that the lowest track kids were way above the average performance of the top performing industrial countries. I thought, wait a minute. That's a really different picture than what tracking is in the United States. They were basically sorting their kids out between, if you have a 10-point scale, between about 7 and 10, and not letting anybody fall below a 7. That's a different thing than having a 10-point scale. That's my point.
Well, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. I'll just make a few observations. One, I agree with all of the data that Mark presented. Everywhere I go, all the conferences I go, either as a CEO across the state or as a member of the chairman of the Hampshire Business for Education and Business Coalition. All of that data, we're an aging population, the rate of poverty is increasing, the economic gap is increasing, the drug problem. Those are all facts, and we've really taken the last couple of years to make sure that all businesses and hopefully the public understand that. The flip side, though, is I'm a lot more optimistic that we can do something about that. I'm not, I don't think Mark was trying to be pessimistic, but I think if you looked at those slides and listened, you might end up, oh my God, we're in trouble. But I really think as a state we have an opportunity if we seize the moment. And here's what I mean by that. Now that those facts are out there, we know, for example, that it's early learning. Okay, if we invest in 0 to 4 years, all the other problems down the road will take care of itself. So the best correlation between success in school and the dropout rate is how we treat people from 0 to 4. So we can seize the moment. We can make more financial investments in pre-K. We can be more supportive of the 0 to 4 years. That's simple. We also, as the coalition, has put out an initiative along with the community college system, 65-25, that by the year 2025, the 65% of the adult population has either a college degree or credentials so they can get one of the job openings. By the way, there are plenty of jobs out there. When I talk to my CEO colleagues, is that we don't have the qualified populace. So the 65-25 goal that we put out there is to do that. Now you might say, that doesn't sound, Mark's probably thinking, having 65% of the population college educated or credentialed by 2025 doesn't sound that great, but we want to be realistic. Currently the statistic is about 48%. So to grow it to 65% in 10 years, that's going to be a challenge, but we can do it. We also have a program called the Scholars Program. Talk about one of the points he made in the slides is that we encourage our students, or should encourage our students, to take challenging AP courses. Well, we have a program that does that. It's called the Scholars Program. It's orchestrated AP courses. There's a STEM component to it now, but it's funded on a shoestring. And it's basically run by one gentleman named Scott Power. We should fund that to a greater level, and we will get students to take more challenging courses. When I'm out there speaking with parents and students, I say to them, take courses that are challenging. Don't worry about the grade point average. Take courses that are meaningful, that you have passion for. And the Scholars Program would do that. The coalition is also encouraging what we call ED squared, which stands for Education-Driven Economic Development. What's been true since the 70s would be true now. The older I get, the more I see. The more highly educated the populace, the more well you are physically and mentally, the more civil the society, and it's better for the economy. So we have a tremendous commissioner or leadership team. As you saw from the slide, she has limited resources, so how we can help is focus our limited resources on all these great innovations that we're doing. So for example, we know we have to develop the new science standards. And we should be allowed to do that in a very innovative way without having to worry about all the politics associated with that. We need to focus our limited resources on the great laboratory that is New Hampshire, as opposed to, I know I spent, and Representative Ladd is there, but I spent January and February living at the State House testifying on various bills that would have eroded public school education. We got to get away from that and focus on the great things that New Hampshire does. And with my real paying job, I get to travel across the country. Everywhere I go, people say, oh my God, New Hampshire's doing all this innovation and extended learning opportunities, competency-based education. I come back home in New Hampshire and I'm always trying to defend that stuff. So we really should understand that we have this great, great opportunity to address all of the issues that Mark mentioned if we invest in early learning and do the proper other public policy investments and move forward as opposed to moving backwards. So that's what I would say. So I agree with all the data that's presented there, but I think if we seize the moment now, make the appropriate public policy decisions and get businesses behind all this, we can really counteract all of those negative trends.
I would just like to ask you, so we were discussing earlier your thoughts on STEM education and the focus on STEM. Would you like to share any thoughts on that?
I was telling the representative about an occasion on which I was invited by the Triangle Coalition. This is coalition of people who have been pressing for STEM in this country for, God, close to 30 years now, to address them on the subject of STEM. And I gave them a speech in which I said I didn't actually think STEM as it was conceived made very much sense. Fortunately, the executive director of the organization knew what I was going to say before I got up on the platform, so he wasn't astounded. What I was saying to him was that it is a mirage to believe that you can make a big improvement in the supply of people coming out of high school who are very good at science, engineering, and mathematics and technology without changing the system. We have the reason that our kids have a very poor command of middle school math when they get to community college is because, as I was telling you earlier, because we're selecting our elementary school teachers from the bottom of the kids coming out of our high schools, and they don't understand the math. So what would make anybody think that by hiring a few more teachers of mathematics in high school, we're going to change that? It's not going to happen. You'll get marginal differences in the number of kids who know mathematics, but you won't get a systemic change. The only way to get a systemic change is to greatly increase the pool of people from which you're selecting your elementary, middle, and high school teachers so they know a lot more math. And that means changing the whole system. It can't be done with a math initiative. It can't be done with a science initiative. It can't be done with a technology program. You've got to make a decision that you want a higher quality teaching force. Nobody is going to let you pay twice as much to a technology teacher as you pay to an English or a history teacher in high school. It's not going to happen. So if you look at the market now, as you were saying a moment ago, there are plenty of shortages. It's not that industry's not offering jobs. It is the jobs they have to offer are not being taken by people who are qualified for them. That's the issue. So there's an enormous shortage of people with math and science skills. In that situation, you cannot hire very many. Only the most dedicated are going to be a math and science teacher in high school if they can go into industry and make literally 2 or 3 times as much money and much better working conditions. You're not going to solve that with a STEM program. You have to redesign the whole workforce and the compensations. That's my point. I am not pessimistic. For me to be pessimistic, I would have to believe that Americans cannot do what the Taiwanese have done, what the Singaporeans have done, what the Japanese have done, what the people in Hong Kong have done, what the people in Shanghai have done, what the people in Australia have done, what the people in Canada have done, what the people in the Netherlands have done, what the people in Finland have done. And I am not going to come before you and tell you that New Hampshire can't do that. Of course it can do that. This is the country that can do, aren't we? So I wasn't getting up here to tell you that I am pessimistic, that I don't think we can match their performance. I know damn well we can. All we have to do is to decide that we want to do it. But I will differ with you. I don't think we're going to solve this with the 3 or 4 initiatives you were describing. People who have been advocating early childhood education have pointed to the effects that it has in the early years. People who are opposed to it say, yes, but those effects wear off by the time the kids get to middle school. To which I say, for Pete's sake, what would you expect? You send a kid who's been really well educated in 1st and 2nd grade into a dysfunctional system, and of course the effects wear off by middle school. Our problem is that we look for silver bullet solutions. Early childhood is not a silver bullet solution. It does not take care of everything else. Better early childhood education is not going to give us highly qualified math teachers in our elementary schools. How could it? It's a both and. We do have to think, in my view, about this as a system and not imagine that with a few targeted initiatives, we can match the performance of the top performing countries. I honestly believe we can. Things will be better, but not good enough.
So, I am the biggest believer in holistic solutions, but holistic solutions have component parts like early learning, so I don't disagree with that. I also meant to mention that one of the things that I've seen at the state board since I've been on since 2007 is we're spending much more time on the teacher training courses at universities. We have people don't realize this, but in addition to K through 12, we're responsible for certifying university programs, so-called 600 series. So we're spending a lot of time making sure that the teachers coming out of the colleges and universities are teaching 21st century stuff as opposed to old school. So I wasn't saying you're pessimistic, but I think I'm a big believer in the holistic approach, but that is made up of specific components that I think we can address. So.
Thank you. Mark, thank you. I've known Mark, I don't know how many years, over 10 years now, and his talk today is so inspiring for me. I've always felt in my role as a teacher, as administrator, working with the School of Education, as Deputy Commissioner, that the people we put in front of our children are so critically important. And we have to choose them carefully. We have to invest in them. In our teacher education programs, we've had so many of these same conversations over and over again. We have a group of higher institutions of higher ed that are coming together on a regular basis, having these conversations. But I think we've gotten to the point where we are able to do it, to create a continuum of learning with an agenda that our schools are ready for children, are ready for the children, each child they teach, and the students can move through the system as they're ready. In this pre-K through 20 continuum, how do we train our teachers? And I think Mark has done a wonderful job talking about that today. The one problem that I feel like we run up against time and time again, everybody's gone to school, and so often in our communities, I hear parents say, well, the way they did it was good enough for me, why do we need to change it? So Mark, my question is, how do we communicate the urgency to our local communities, our legislators, the power brokers, but everyday citizens about the importance of really creating this system that in the long run will make New Hampshire, which is already a shining star, that sparkling star that competes with everybody.
I think you've put your finger on the single most important problem. I think it's very hard for policymakers to make big changes in policy unless the public is behind them. And what the Gallup PDK poll shows us year after year after year is that American parents and citizens believe that the American education system is in rotten shape, but their own schools are doing fine. And people always did what you just did. They laugh. And I've actually thought a fair amount about how could they believe both things at the same time, and it actually makes perfect sense to me, and here's why. I think people believe that the system is not doing well because people like myself, who are consumed by data, tell them that. All these reports are coming out with all this data, and they constantly show, as you said, that the system's not performing well. On the other hand, when their kids bring their homework home, their parents look at it, and they think back to when they took that course at that grade level, and they said, God, this stuff is really hard. It's got all the stuff I was responsible for, and then it's got stuff I can't do, right? But my kids are getting A's and B's. So clearly, our schools are doing fine. right? Isn't that the conclusion you would come to on that evidence? What they're doing is comparing how their kids are doing against the same standard that was set for them 20, 25, 30 years ago, whenever it was. What the data I showed you said was that by that standard, we're doing fine, right? Our scores have not declined on NAEP in the 40 years that NAEP has been in business. What the parents don't understand is how the world has changed, which is what I was doing with you this morning. It took me an hour to do it. There's no reason for them to understand that. Nobody's ever explained it to them, right? The connections between how kids do in school and these enormous changes in the rates of drug use, in the fact that our uncle, who is 47, can't find a job and had a really good one for all those years. Those are not obvious connections. And I think we, as a group, have done a very poor job of explaining it to the citizens of New Hampshire and the 49 other states in the United States. And until we find a way to help them make those connections, they're going to say, you go fix somebody else's school, but don't you change mine, because it's doing fine. Most Americans believe that there is a problem, but if you took the minority and poor kids out of the equation, we would have one of the best performing systems in the world. That's what the data show. It's not true. It's not true. When PISA releases its data every 3 years, they divide the scores for countries, the kids in countries, into 4 different performance quartiles. So you know what proportion of kids in the United States are scoring in the top quartile and in the bottom quartile and each quartile in between. And what the data show is that a relatively small proportion of our kids are scoring in the top quartile and the next quartile below it. We have a performance problem at every single level of the performance spectrum. But that's not what the American people believe. They think it's the poor black and Hispanic kids. Otherwise, we'd be doing great. So as long as most voters think that it's somebody else's school and somebody else's kids are the problem, we're not going to be able to do what we need to do.
And if anyone is interested, the PISA data is available online for anybody who wants to take a look at it. So just Google it and it's there. Would anybody like to have a follow-up question or comment? No? Okay. Go ahead.
One of the things that you hit upon that I think, coming from a classroom that I have about, is how do these countries develop a career ladder? Here it's one stop. You're either going to go to be an administrator or you're going to stay in the classroom teaching, and there's no incentive. A lot of people like myself didn't want to go into administration, but there's no way to advance your profession. So talk a little bit about that would be great.
Really interesting you should ask that. We have advisory panels in our organization, some just really great people from all over the country. When we started talking about career ladders, those folks in our advisory panels who are school superintendents, almost all of them came up to me and said, my God, if something like this had been available, I would still be in the classroom. Same thing. They said the only way I could advance, make enough money to feed my family, is to go into administration, and I really didn't want to do it. You are not alone. If you want to have a look at what a well-developed career ladder system looks like, get up on the website of the Singapore Ministry of Education and the Shanghai Municipal Education Commission, and you'll see what they developed. You won't see how they developed it. You'll see what they developed, and in both of those cases, it was the ministry well, in the case of Shanghai, the Municipal Education Commission. In the case of Singapore, the ministry that worked on it for a long time internally, but they involved lots and lots of school administrators in it. And the way these systems work basically is that well, I'll take Singapore as an example. If you're a teacher in Singapore, you start out in effect as a provisional teacher under the supervision of a master teacher until you are no longer a provisional teacher, you're a regular licensed classroom teacher. Then there's a career ladder for you to start going up as a teacher, but then it branches. And you have a choice of 3 different pathways. One pathway is towards school administration, right? You get a succession of leadership positions which culminate in principal. Actually, it doesn't culminate in principal because you can go right straight up. In the Singapore system, the person who's got Ginny's job would be the Minister of Education. And that's the highest paid education official in Singapore. So there's an administrative ladder that doesn't stop at superintendent. It's going to seem weird to you all, but in most of the countries that we deal with, it would seem extremely odd that school superintendents make more than commissioners of education. In those countries, the commissioner is the senior education official in the country. So teachers report to principals, who report to area superintendents, who report to superintendents, who report to the minister or the permanent secretary. It's one system, in other words. You can decide you want to go up the route to master teacher, which means you are on a route that will keep you teaching all your career. But there are many steps to go through before you get to be master teacher. In most of these systems that have a system like this, master teachers are paid pretty much the same as principals are paid. They are viewed, in effect, as having roughly similar responsibilities, the same level of responsibility, but the nature of the responsibility is different because, in effect, the master teacher is the expert in the content and the instruction. The third route is being a specialist. That will take you into the ministry as a curriculum expert or a special ed expert or so on. It leads to various kinds of expert roles in the system all the way up into the ministry. In effect, in our case, the central office of the district or the State Department of Education. And the way this works is that the steps are clearly spelled out. What they qualify you for is spelled out. The criteria that you have to meet are spelled out. The process of review against those criteria is all spelled out. It's a very fair, you talk to the teachers in this system, they think it's a very fair system. And we've talked to them and that's what they tell us. So that's how it works. But it's usually a very participative process to get there.
One of the concerns that I have, I'm a big supporter of charter schools, and they're offering a wide array of experience and choice for parents. But a concern that I see growing across the country is it seems that it's becoming it's bifurcating public education. In your research, in your studies of what's going on in countries around the world that are doing really well, do you see those kinds of environments developing, or is it more systemic within the country?
Oh, different things have happened, as you would expect in different countries. Gosh, where to begin? I'm going to try and, I don't want to kick my shin, so I'm going to try and be as brief as I can be. Some very strong advocates of charter schools point to some countries in Europe and say, well, the whole country is nothing but charter schools. And in my view, they're both right and wrong. For example, in the Netherlands, any 12 families can petition the state to create a school. So that sounds like a charter system. Furthermore, the right to basically run that school is given over to third-party entities like the Catholic Church. So now you're certain it's a charter school system, right? That's what these folks are essentially saying. When we went to visit in first the Netherlands and then Flemish Belgium, which is in effect the same system, what we found is that when we visited a school run by the Catholic Church, the only way that we knew that it was a school run by the Catholic Church was when we were in the stairwells and we saw the stained glass windows. Because when we went to visit the classes, they had the same syllabuses that all the other schools had, and the teachers were trained in the same way to deliver those syllabuses. When we went to the Flemish Ministry of Education, we discovered that mathematics in Flemish Belgium is run by 5 mathematics inspectors in their Ministry of Education. Those mathematics inspectors create the national curriculum in mathematics themselves. They create the exams themselves. They have power in the law to shut down any school in Flemish Belgium when they go and inspect it and find that it is not using the curriculum that they have specified. And they told us with a straight face that in their private capacity, they are employed by the textbook companies to chair the advisory committees for the math textbooks. Really? That's a chance? That happened by chance? No, I don't think so. So, what you have in the Netherlands and Flemish Belgium is a system in which these other entities have certain responsibilities, but they are expected to deliver the national curriculum, period, full stop, and all of them to be examined in the national exams against the national standards. These are highly regulated systems. So if your idea of what a charter school is, it's run by a third-party entity, yes, they are all charter schools. If your idea of a charter school is that it leads to enormous variety and independence of choice among the operators, no, no, no. That doesn't happen. So, I'm sorry this took a minute, but it's complicated.
So, just respond to that.
So Mary and I have been friends for a long time too. So I do want to, I think it's important to point out what Mark said. I think that we sort of have a phenomenon going on in New Hampshire. We have 25 charters, and in their initial evolution and their startup, you know, the people saw them as, you know, that they were going to create this whole other system. And I think it's very unique to New Hampshire. We have 25 successful charters that view themselves as part of the public school system. They are working hard to understand the population, what parents are looking for. They're sharing with our public schools. They're working closer than they have in the past. So I think that's, I really want to point that out, because while I think initially there was a huge fear of bifurcation in the system, and that can happen anywhere, anytime, any place. We have it with standards, we have it with assessment, but I do think that our charters have come together and looking at our state as a whole and have offered us a new way, and we're offering them a different way. And I think that's very important to point out, because I wouldn't want people to leave the meeting today thinking that the charters have had a negative impact on our schools. And we have a public school, we have our union person here, we talked about this. So having differences, and what I think is really important is you can't speak out of both sides of your mouth. If we're looking for things to be different, if we're looking at improvement, if we're looking at making major changes, when a change comes about, then we have to carefully understand whether or not it had a positive change. And I think we're in a good place with our charters. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that before you left.
All right, we have about 10 minutes still in our time for our panel, so I'd like to open up to legislators if they have any questions. Representative Myler?
Thank you.
Can you project for everyone?
Mel Myler, Representative Hopkinton Concord. I want you to address whole systems. It's a concept that most folks don't understand. So if you would define what is a whole system, theoretically, how does time it takes. I mean, we live in a society where you want a magic wand to make it better immediately. The whole systems approach, it doesn't happen that way. So if you could define what the concept of whole systems and how it might apply, for example, to Singapore. How the whole system, well, any country you visited, how it works. What is the difference with the whole systems approach versus the segmentation approach that we have in this country?
Excellent question. Where to begin? And how do I avoid the kick in the shins? Yes, so I was promised that if I went on too long, I would get a gentle nudge. So the problem that the top performers, after they analyzed how their economies were changing, the problem that they realized they had to take on was how to offer to all of their kids the kind and quality of education that up to that point they had offered only to a small minority, which has meant obviously enormously ratcheting up the quality of education that they delivered to most of their kids without spending any more money because they didn't have any. Right? So what they basically concluded was they couldn't do that with a set of independent initiatives. They would have to design a new system. So your question is, what exactly do I mean by that? Okay. If you're operating, I said this a little earlier and I want to come back to it, if the goal that you have as a country, which is what our goal was back in, say, 1910 or 1915, if we run our minds back to 1910 or 1915, the situation we faced was that we were a very rapidly industrializing country on a scale the world had never seen before, using mass production manufacturing methods for that part of the economy, which was the real driver. We needed people in those factories and in our retail stores and in our white-collar establishments that could do basic reading and writing. That was an enormous challenge because at that time, we were beginning to get enormous migration from the South, kids with families that couldn't read. We were getting enormous migration from Eastern European countries, families that couldn't read in any language, right, or do basic mathematics. We had, at that time, remember, we had very few people who had been to college, any kind of college. We were setting up secondary schools, which we hadn't had before, all over the country, taking kids between the ages of what, 11 and 16 maybe, who would otherwise not have been in school. So we were bringing in enormous volumes of kids into our schools, many of whom and whose families could not read, couldn't do basic math. So getting them up to and we didn't have a lot of college-educated people who could deliver. So you had you think about it as an engineering problem, as a design problem. How the hell are you going to solve that? Well, what we ended up doing was saying, okay, we're going to hire teachers who have no more than 2 years of education beyond high school. At the high school level, we're only 2 years ahead of the kids they're going to teach. We set up normal schools to do that. That's what they were. They're basically the equivalent of today's community colleges. That's how our teachers were trained. That was a big step forward. And, but we, remember, if you read Horace Mann, what Horace Mann tells you is, we were as soon as this young woman, because he says we're going to hire women because they're compliant. They'll do what we tell them to do. Go back and read the literature. That's what it says. They're compliant. We'll go back and they'll do what so we're going to run the thing like they run the big factories. We're going to hire people with a college education to be factory superintendents and the people right around them. They're the people who are going to tell the people on the factory floor exactly what to do and how to do it. Right? This is where the pajama came from. That's a system. I'm describing to you a system that has interconnected parts and pieces, right? It's based on an image of what The objective is with the kids. It's a pretty low level of education, but most of them don't have it. We think it can mostly be delivered by people who themselves don't have very much education. They've got to be very closely supervised because as soon as the women get pregnant, they're out, right? That's how the system works, right? So you're constantly bringing new people in. You can't give them very much training. They've got to be supervised by people who actually know what to do. That's the people in the central office. It's a factory system. What our competitors understood was there's no way that you can take that factory system and educate everybody up to the standard that only the elites have been educated to. You can't do it. You need a different system. It's not just a matter of putting in a different way to teach reading. It's not just a matter of raising up your licensure standard a notch. It's not just a matter of changing your teacher education institutions so that there's more experience for the kids teaching before they get their degree. No, 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 no. You have to source your teachers from a different pool. You have to make entrance into the institutions much harder to get into. You have to provide a different education for these teachers so they come out really knowing math, really knowing history, really knowing physics. That was what the other part of my remarks was about, but you see my point. The whole thing is a system. If you simply pay teachers more, but they're not more qualified, you're wasting your money. If you raise your standards to get into the teacher education institutions, but you don't make teacher education, if you don't make teaching more attractive, then all you've done is shut down your supply of teachers. If you try and make teaching more attractive by offering more money up front, but the conditions of work don't change, they'll leave 3 years after you hire them. So what I'm basically saying is once you've got your objective straight, it's like an engineer designing a plane. You have to make sure every part and piece, right, works for that objective. Each part and piece has to support the other pieces, right? It has to make it possible for them to do their part. We don't think that way. We think in terms of initiatives. We're going to have a STEM initiative. We're going to have an early learning initiative. We're going to have this initiative, that initiative, the other initiative. And it's gotten us absolutely nowhere. As I said earlier, ExxonMobil has spent an enormous amount of money on STEM initiatives in the United States. But they've spent nothing on reforming elementary education, which is where the basic problem is. You can't fix the problem in high school. We've got research scientists have figured out the size of the, first of all, your reading vocabulary is much bigger than your speaking. It's true for everybody. Research scientists have figured out how large your vocabulary has to be in order to survive in college. Right? They've then taken that number, it's a certain number of words, and said in order to get there, here's how many new words you have to learn each year. They've also figured out how many words you have to have when you enter first grade. Right? So what we know for a surety is that there are a lot of kids coming into first grade who don't have a big enough vocabulary to understand first grade. By the time they get to fourth grade, it's all over. It's all over, right? It's mathematically impossible to acquire enough vocabulary in the remaining years to get to the point where you can understand a typical college textbook. We have to think like engineers. When I mean a system, I mean you thought this all through. You set a clear objective and you thought through piece by piece, part by part, what it's going to take to get there. That's what the Singaporeans have done. That's what the people in Shanghai have done. That's what the people in Flemish Belgium have done. While we've been passing initiatives.
I know we have 2 more questions. Hopefully we can do those quickly before we move on to our wrap-up. So Representative Gorman and then Representative Ladd.
Thank you, Mark, for coming. Welcome. I represent a district in Nashville where there are 2 elementary schools. And over 60% of the children are on free and reduced lunch. And we have food pantries, so the parents can come in and take. And I was very interested in when you talked about strong supports for children and families. So does that align in any way with the countries that, of whom we're speaking?
Oh yeah, I mean, emphatically yes.
What do they do?
Well, what they do differs by country. It even differs a lot by region of the world. The Scandinavians are famous for providing very high levels of support to families with young children. They probably do more of that than any governments do anywhere else in the world. So there are all kinds of subsidies for pregnant women, and nutrition programs, home visiting programs. I mean, you all know what the list is. It goes on and on and on. And they provide many, many different forms of support for pregnant women, for young mothers, and for people in their society who don't have jobs, people living on the street and so on. All of that is what I was referring to, in addition to the things that are more clearly focused on education, like early childhood education. That's not true of all of Europe. There are many countries in Europe that provide fewer programs and less well-funded programs than the typical Scandinavian country does for its citizens. The real changes are, but all of what I've described has been true in Europe since the Second World War, more or less. In Asia, the situation is really very interesting because when we first started doing this work about 27 years ago, governments in Asia provided very little support of this kind, of the kind I just described. Very little. They basically, first of all, women in Asia, when we first started doing this kind of research, rarely did paid work. They were expected to be home. The Japanese situation was fairly typical. The women and children lived off at a place that they could afford, which was often a suburb that was so far away that it took a half-day train trip to get there, right? So the husband would live in the city where the factory was in a dormitory and come home on weekends. And the women, the mothers, were expected to be home with the kids, period, full stop. So when we asked at that time, 27 years ago, what provisions the Japanese made for help to young mothers and children and all that, the answer was actually very little. They now provide as much as the Scandinavian countries do. And the principal driver in that is the fact that they have been working really hard to get women into their workforce. If you think New Hampshire is aging, you should take a look at Japan. And they don't want non-Japanese in Japan. They really don't. So they're not interested in importing, they're not interested in immigrants coming into Japan, and they know they're not going to be able to run their economy if there are only a handful of people in the workforce supporting this enormous number of old people, right? There's only one answer to that for them, which is to get their women into the paid workforce, and they've been working hard at that. And so they've been really ramping up government services to families with young children at a very rapid rate in Japan. Now that's not true all over Asia. It varies a lot. The situation in China is very different. Chinese had a system very like the Soviet system in which people went to work for an employer. It might be a steel mill. And the steel mill was responsible for providing housing, health care, schooling, you name it. The whole damn shooting match. It was like the steel mill was a city. And so you got all that when you went to work for the steel mill. What's happened in China is that after Deng Xiaoping set the economy free, he relieved all those companies of all those obligations, which they were quick to accept. And that left an awful lot of Chinese without health care, without retirement, often without a place to live, on and on. So It's been very different in China than it has been in Japan. I could go on, but you can see that it's very, very different. When we've looked at this from an American lens, if I can oversimplify this, there are 2 or 3 things that become very important to us. One is that kids who are living in situations of concentrated poverty are often in a situation in which they can't get access to decent dental care, they can't get access to decent medical care. Their family may be living under enormous stress, either on the street or in a shelter or something like that. There may be abuse. You know what the list of problems are. In those situations, what we've seen work best, at least at a certain level, are situations in which the school becomes the center of an integrated social service program. It's open for many hours during the day. It's available to kids when their parents are at the workplace and they have no other place to put the kids. It's the place where families on welfare sign up for a wide range of services, making it a lot easier for them to get them, but also for the agencies involved to know what the other agencies are doing with the same family. Very important. So there's a whole host of things that go with that phrase, integrated social services, but that can make a big difference. The second big thing is what happens after the kids are in school. What we see in the top performing countries typically is that schools serving disadvantaged kids get more teachers per kid than schools that don't. It's pretty much that simple. In a few countries, not many, like Singapore, they actually assign their very best teachers to the kids who are most disadvantaged.
Okay, thank you.
In Shanghai, they use the career ladder in a very interesting way. They ask school principals of successful schools not to give up their principalship, but to become mentors, in effect, to principals of less successful schools, sometimes to take the whole school under their wing, and therefore to take the principal of that school under their wing. They ask teachers in very successful schools to go and teach in tough schools. Some Americans say, well, they can do this because they are autocratic countries and they can just tell them to do it. That's not how the system works. They basically say, you don't have to do this. But if you want to go up the career ladder, there's no way to do it unless you serve in those schools or take on the job of mentoring people who are leading schools like that. So the people who are ambitious, who want to move up the career ladder, they volunteer to take these assignments on. And you get a real rich distribution of very talented people taking on tough schools, tough problems, tough teachers. Those are 3 different ways in which they address this problem.
Thank you.
Can we do one more question? Okay. Representative Ladd, very quickly. Both of you very quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. New Hampshire being a state where 6% of our budget comes from the feds, 24% from the state, and the rest from the local tax base. My concern is, one of the greatest fears I have is every time we talk about getting in another program like preschool education, and the feds get involved, then who ends up paying the tab in the long run? The local taxpayer. So I'd like to know, when we're looking at adequacy funding in this state, I take the bell curve. On the left-hand side, we have those kids which are learning disabled and reading and math, etc. And special services, you have your English language learners, you have your migrant ed, which is not necessarily on the left side. But we have all these costs. Then you look at the other side in K through 8, and what are we doing to support that? We're doing very little other than the base adequacy amount of money we provide. So it looks like a lot of the effort is going to the left-hand side, to those lower quartiles, but what are these European and other countries in Asia doing in terms of these costs?
She said quickly.
Yeah, he's going to be on that.
This is a long conversation, but what we've done, because we have tackled these problems both at the federal level and the state level with categorical programs, we have actually wound up in the, and I don't know, I haven't studied this in New Hampshire, so I can't speak to New Hampshire, but generally what we have done is create categorical programs, and what that has done is to create separate administrations within the state level and at the school district level of people responsible for those programs. So when we go and visit schools out in the field and we ask the principal about the staff, they'll tell us about their regular teachers, and then they'll tell us about these people who are here because of this program, those people who are here because of that program, those people who are here because of that program. We have created a giant, we've created schools in which principals don't have control over their program, their staff, or the way they use their resources, because we have post-hold this entire system that you have been describing. That is not what the top performing countries do. They basically figure out how much money the school is going to get and hold the school responsible for delivering the services. You'll find many fewer people in central office. You'll find fewer people in the ministry responsible for these programs. You'll find them responsible for other things, but not for categorical programs. It's a different way of thinking about how you run the system. Again, I have no idea how this plays out in New Hampshire. You'll have to figure that out, but I can tell you what we found elsewhere.
We have all those pigeonholes.
Well, I'd go and take a look at them.
Very well done. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you to all of the panelists. Really appreciate your participation today. So next we're going to move on to wrap up. And that is going to be Lee Posey and Marc Tucker and Representative Ladd and Representative Guile. So thank you very much.